In honor of National Chest Day today, Monday, I'm going to be doing a podcast, if you'll call it that, on how to improve your one rep max on the bench press. In other words, when you get asked how much you bench, which is the most common question you will get in the gym, you can be proud of your answer by listening to this podcast. Um, so let's start off by saying this. To increase your one rep max. Keep in mind that getting stronger is a powerlifting goal and not a bodybuilding goal. So if you're trying to improve your one rep max on the bench press, just keep in mind that that's not going to necessarily equate to a bigger chest. If you're genetically predisposed to a bigger chest, then it might grow your chest, but you're not going to have like an Arnold Schwarzenegger chest by benching heavy. Um, so when it comes to having a higher bench press, and this works for all lifts, like the stuff that I'm going to tell you in this podcast, it could really work well for any lift that you're trying to improve on. And so we have to talk about the concept of force production. If you want a higher bench press or a higher deadlift or a higher squat or a higher overhead press or whatever it is, we have to talk about the concept of force production. I mean, the whole goal is to produce enough force to overcome the force that's on the bar. So the first four or five things I'm going to talk about involve how to increase your force production. So let's just get started here. Number one, and this may seem pretty obvious, but I'm going to talk about it anyways. The best way to improve your bench press, the best way to get stronger, is to lift heavy. And I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, if we talk about the SAID principle, specific adaptation to impose demands, your muscles will respond and adapt to the specific demands that you are placing on that muscle. So if you're constantly exposing your muscle to a heavy weight, it's going to get stronger. When I started benching, that was how I improved so quickly. Like when I started lifting, and this was August of 2013. I was really weak. Like I couldn't bench. I could bench 80 for like. I mean, I'm talking 80 pounds for like 10 reps, and that was challenging. And I thought, okay, well, if I want to get stronger, I got to start lifting heavy. And I'll never forget. Like I still remember the numbers. I would do 110 for 3, and that was like really, really hard. And I would do 10 sets of 3. Like I would be out there for just I don't know how long, but but it made sense, right? I mean, like if you constantly place a heavy demand on your body's gonna say, okay, I got to get stronger, and especially when you do that often. I mean, 10 sets of 3, that's quite a bit of volume. 3 sets of 10 at a moderate weight is okay, but 10 sets of 3 at a very heavy weight can be pretty demanding. But the whole point behind it was, well, I'm really going to have to force my body to get used to it because I'm doing it so often. If I just did 3 sets of 3, which would be okay, but 3 sets of 3, your body says, okay, well, this is pretty heavy. I'll get a little stronger. But 10 sets of 3, that really shocks your body. Your body says, okay, I really, really have to get stronger now because he's doing it to me so often. I mean, I using that method, like every time I was able to do 5 reps. Like when I got to 110 for 5, I'd go up again. I remember it was 3 months in, and I was able to hit 225. 3 months into benching, I hit 225. I've been lifting for uh, going on 4 years now, but in 3.5, I was able to hit 500 a couple of weeks ago. Mostly using that method. Like that's the main method that I use is just lift heavy. But let's talk for a minute about why it works. Why specifically, like on a scientific level, why does benching heavy improve your strength? And this works literally for all, like this applies to all the lifts. So you take a beginning bencher and you have them do a bench press. It might look a little sloppy, right? Like one side is going to go up before the other one. It may not come down in a straight line. It's going to be pretty sloppy. And most would attribute that to weakness, but it's actually not weakness. So your muscles are made up of muscle fibers. And depending on the level of the lifter, the percentage of muscle fibers in that muscle may differ. So let me try to explain that a little bit differently. If a beginning bencher is benching, he might only be using 15% of the muscle fibers in his pectoral and triceps and shoulder muscles. Whereas an advanced powerlifter may use 75% or above. I'm not sure what the actual numbers are, but the point is that when you an advanced powerlifter is able to use a higher percentage of those muscle fibers, and that's really why powerlifters have a stronger central nervous system. A lot of people think that bigger muscles equals big strength, and that is precisely the difference between powerlifting and bodybuilding. When we talk about bodybuilding, we're talking about aesthetics. When we're talking about powerlifting, a 180-pound powerlifter who may look a little out of shape can probably bench more than a 225-pound bodybuilder, even though the bodybuilder has the bigger muscles. Why? It's not necessarily that the bodybuilder is weak. It is that the powerlifter has a stronger central nervous system and is therefore able to recruit a higher percentage of those muscle fibers. So we call a powerlifter, or anyone who's been lifting a while, neurologically efficient, whereas a beginning lifter is neurologically inefficient. And we actually have terms for these. When we're talking about the percentage of muscle fibers that are activated in a certain muscle. So like, let's just say a beginning lifter might only use 15% of his pectoral muscles, whereas an advanced might use 60%, 75%, or even above. That is called intramuscular coordination, the percentage of muscle fibers. So you're not intramuscularly coordinated when you start working out. That's why your form may look a little sloppy on quite a few of the lifts. You're not recruiting a high percentage of the muscle fibers in the target muscle, and so therefore you don't have proper muscular coordination. And similarly, across multiple muscle groups, which the bench press does because it is a compound movement, we talk about intermuscular coordination. So your triceps, your shoulders, your pectorals, all of those working together. So intermuscular coordination. So again, this is why benching heavy is so great for building strength, because what happens is when you bench heavy, like when you're benching, 85, 90% of your 1 rep max, you are necessitating, out of necessity, a higher percentage of your muscle fibers have to start firing. They have to start activating. Because if they don't, the weight's going to come down and crush you. And as you train that heavy, 85% and above of your 1 rep max, you start gearing your central nervous system towards activating a higher percentage of those muscle fibers. And then you start getting stronger. And therefore, we have to distinguish between, having muscular strength and having a strong central nervous system. The bodybuilder might have stronger muscular strength, but the powerlifter has a stronger central nervous system. So if you're talking about who is the best bencher, keep in mind we're talking about a powerlifting goal. So bench heavy. Number 2. So the issue with benching heavy too often, and I dealt with this quite a bit, is that you're going to fry your central nervous system. Your central nervous system kind of goes into overdrive when it's overworked, and that can lead to adrenal fatigue as well as a host of number of other issues. So it's good to switch things up. Benching heavy is by far the best method for getting stronger on the bench press, but you're not going to be able to do it too often. So let's talk about a way that you could still exert maximum force, because again, we're talking about force production without benching heavy. And this is the method of dynamic effort. Now, what do I mean by dynamic effort? Well, let's go back to what we're talking about. We're talking about a powerlifting goal, right? In physics, what is power? Power is equal to work over time. And this should make sense, right? A powerful person can do a lot of work in a little bit of time. Now, let's define work. Work is equal to force times distance. The amount of work you do is however much force you're applying over however long you have to apply it for. Okay, so again, it's coming back down to force again. Now, what is force? Newton's second law. Force equals mass times acceleration. So, force production. Usually, everyone likes to focus on that mass aspect, right? That's what we were just talking about, benching heavy. We're talking about the mass. But there is a way to exert more force without going heavy, and that is accelerating the bar as quickly as possible. Let's do just a little bit of math, okay? When you do heavy, like let's just say your 1 rep max is 100 pounds, right? So let's just suppose you're doing 100 pounds. When you're benching 100 pounds, uh, you're you're not accelerating the bar very quickly, right? You have a hard time getting it up. It's going very slow. Like let's just say it's going at 1/2 meter per second squared. Like that's the acceleration of the bar. So your power output is, or your force output is 50, right? 100 times a half is 50. Um, the unit should theoretically be newtons, but pound is already a measurement of force. So let's just, for the sake of being correct, let's just say 50. 50 is our force output. Now let's suppose you drop the weight a little bit, and you drop it down to say 80% of your 1 rep max. So you're doing 80 pounds, but you focus on accelerating that bar as quickly as possible. What's going to happen? Let's just say, suppose you accelerate the bar at 1 meter per second squared. Now your force output is 80. What does that higher force production mean? Higher force equals higher work, which therefore equals higher power, and higher power equals a higher 1 rep max. So, by focusing on accelerating the bar as quickly as possible during your submaximal lifts, you are therefore actually exerting more force than you would with just the 1 rep max alone, and therefore contributing to a higher 1 rep max in the long run. So the best way to go about doing this, I like doing it at around, I used 80 for a reason. I usually like doing these at around 80% of my 1 rep max. I'll just do 1 or 2 reps. We're not going crazy. We're not doing, at 80%, you should be able to do maybe 8 reps, 8 to 10 reps. I only do 2. I'll lower kind of slowly and then focus on accelerating that bar as quickly as possible, because the higher the acceleration, the higher the force. The higher the force, the higher the work, the higher the work, the higher the power, and finally, the higher the power, the higher your 1 rep max. So, accelerate that bar. All right, number 3. And I talked about this quite a bit in my last podcast, but I'm going to mention it again, and that is doing slow eccentric movements. Cannot be overstated how important a slow eccentric movement is. For those who did not really listen to my last podcast or who don't know, the bench press in every lift has 3 portions to it. You have the eccentric, which is where your muscles are lengthening. So with the bench press, that would be where you're lowering the bar to your chest. You have the isometric pause at the bottom, and then you have the concentric portion, which is where you shorten your muscles, thereby exerting force. So that's usually the part of the lift that everybody focuses most on, right? That's where you exert that force. But by doing a slow eccentric movement, you are increasing the time that your muscle is under tension. And remember, we were talking about that intra and intermuscular coordination, right? So if you use a slow eccentric movement, like let's just suppose that instead of just lowering the bar, you lower that bar for 4 seconds, 4 to 6 seconds. What's going to happen? You are teaching your body control throughout that whole range of motion for the lift, right? I mean, the eccentric portion, the range of motion for the eccentric portion is the same range of motion as it is for the concentric. So what you're doing is you're teaching your body muscular control throughout that range of motion, and therefore improving your inter and intramuscular coordination, right? If you're focusing on a slow movement, then your form is going to be better, right? Your muscles are going to be under tension longer. What's going to be the response of your muscles when they're under tension for a long period of time? More fibers are going to activate. That higher intra and intermuscular coordination are going to contribute to a greater force output. That greater force output is going to contribute to a higher 1 rep max. So for slow eccentric movements, I usually like doing, say, 4 to 6 seconds, and anywhere between 4 to 6 reps. It's kind of hard to get above 6 reps at a decent weight. Like today I benched, and I mean, I would do I did 10 sets of 3 heavy. And when I did my slow eccentrics, I mean, I could only use 225, and I could only get like 6 reps. It was pretty brutal. So you're not going to be able to use like a super heavy weight with these. So just 4 to 6 seconds lowering, and then 4 to 6 reps. You could do this for 2 or 3 sets. Just again, focus on that slow eccentric movement, good form, perfect form, and then for added benefit, pause at the bottom, accelerate the bar as quickly as you can up. Because again, going back to dynamic effort, acceleration contributes to force, which contributes to work, which contributes to power, which contributes to a higher 1 rep max. All right, so we've talked about the concentric portion of the lift, accelerate the bar as quickly as you can. We've talked about the eccentric portion of the lift, lower as slowly as you can. But we haven't really talked about the pause at the bottom. And that is called an isometric movement. And the importance of isometric training also cannot be understated. It is a very crucial part of training that a lot of people overlook. And it can help you in 2 different ways, okay? So, let me suppose that your 1 rep max on the bench is 300, right? So suppose you're doing my program, and suppose you did your, heavy sets, then you did a couple sets with a slow eccentric, then you did a couple where, maybe singles where you just accelerated the bar as quickly as possible with 80%. Now, so you're 300, suppose you want to get to 305. Okay? So what I want you to do is put your bench in a power cage and attach the pins, the J-hooks, or whatever you want to call them, to wherever the halfway part of the movement is. And so your starting position is not going to be all the way up at the top. You're literally trying to push it just the top half of the movement. And I want you to put, say, 315 on the bar. Now, you're not going to be able to move that bar at this point. I mean, your 1 rep max is only 300, right? And you've already exhausted your muscles on top of it. But pushing against an immovable force, what's that going to do for you? Well, remember I said that at a higher percentage of your 1 rep max, say 90% or above, you have that higher intra and intermuscular coordination. There's a high percentage of your muscle fibers firing. What would happen if you're trying to push a weight above your 1 rep max? Even more intra and intermuscular coordination. So what's going to happen is your body's going to sense, hey, I need to be able to push this weight at some point. And it's going to become stronger. You're going to teach your body the intra and intermuscular coordination required to push that heavier weight. So now the next time you go and try to do that 305, you're probably going to get it. Now that's just one example of how an isometric can benefit the training. Let me talk about the bottom part of the lift, because the bottom part of the lift, going back to just regular benching, is an isometric pause. The benefit of training that isometric pause, so like let's suppose you're doing like maybe 75% of your 1 rep max for a set of like 8 to 10. Pause for a second or 2 at the bottom before pushing back up. And what I like to do is I'll actually like unravel my hand from the bar and then ravel it back in. That's the amount of time that I give my pause at the bottom before pushing back up. And what does that do? That's training the push-off movement of the bench. A lot of people, they bounce the weight off their chest. They can get the top half of the movement, but they suck at the bottom half of the movement. So what isometric training allows you to do is train certain aspects of the lift that you may suck at. So suppose you suck at that push-off point. You suck at lifting the bar off your chest, which is why you always have to bounce. Okay, go a little lighter, but pause for 2 or 3 seconds at the bottom before pushing back up. That's training that push-out strength. Suppose you could push up no problem, but you have trouble completing the lift. Suppose at about that halfway point, you can't get the weight up at a decent weight. Okay, go a little bit lighter. And what I want you to do is on the way back up, pause at the part you always have a problem with. You are literally training the muscles at that particular angle to be able to overcome force by holding it there. Your muscles are not contracting, but they're working. That's the beauty of an isometric. And so what's going to happen is now you're going to get better at that angle. And the beauty of it is that there's actually a 15-degree carryover in both directions. In general, if you train isometrics at an angle, it has a 15-degree carryover to both sides. So 15%, 15%, 15 degrees above the portion you're trying to train and 15 degrees below are also going to improve in strength as well. So slow eccentrics will prevent you from plateauing, and it's going to teach your body a higher intra and intermuscular coordination required to lift heavier. All right, so we've talked about the concentric, we've talked about the eccentric, we've talked about the isometric, and we've talked about the benefit of benching heavy in the first place. Let's talk about something you've probably never thought of, you've probably never heard of. It is not taught in gyms, it's not even taught when you're required to be a personal trainer, but it is something that I've learned the benefit of. And it is being able to take advantage of what's called the tension effect. Now, what is the tension effect? All right, let's get a little bit of sciencey here. Anyone who's benched for a while has probably had the following experience. You're lifting heavy, trying to maybe test a 1 rep max, and, you're lowering it, no problem, feels good. Maybe a brief pause at the line, you're pushing it up, you feel like you got it, it looks like you got it, like you just know, like, man, I got this, my muscles can handle this, no problem. You're pushing up, you're almost there, and then all of a sudden, it's almost as if your muscles just shut off. All of a sudden, your spotter has to help you. Your spotter was probably like, holy shit, man, I thought you had that. And you're like, well, I thought I had it, but I don't know what happened. Here's what happened. You have an organ in your body. You've probably never heard of this organ. It's called the Golgi tendon organ. And it is basically intertwined. It's in all of your muscles. And the whole point of the Golgi tendon is to sense tension in your muscles in order to prevent injury. So let me give you an example of how that would apply to the bench press and why that probably happened to you. One of the most common injuries involved with bench pressing is a rotator cuff injury. So suppose, you're benching 405, you thought you had it, you feel really strong, you think you got it. What the Golgi tendon organ does is say, if I let the body complete this lift, if it completes this range of motion, the rotator cuff is going to tear. So it literally just shuts off the muscles involved in the lift in order to prevent injury. Now, granted, the bench press is a horrible lift for the Golgi tendon organ to be activating in, because I'd rather have a torn rotator cuff than have the bar come back down on my neck and kill me. But, the Golgi tendon organ doesn't know that. The Golgi tendon organ just senses the tension and, shuts off the muscle to avoid injury. Now, how do you overcome that? Well, this plays into the whole you're only as strong as your weakest link thing, right? If your rotator cuff is weak, the Golgi tendon organ is going to shut off your pectoral muscles from completing the lift because it doesn't want to tear the rotator cuff. And there's a lot of other muscles involved as well that you just don't normally work or train. Everyone trains, most people train the rear delts because it's a mirror muscle, right? It's a muscle that you can see in the mirror. There are muscles underneath the rear delts. There are muscles, involved with what's called scapular retraction. And if you don't train them often, or if you train them incorrectly, they're going to be weak. And most people, even with rear delts, they train them incorrectly. Why do they train them incorrectly? They train them incorrectly because so many people, they get it, they like doing the whole sets of 10 to 12 thing. And that works for most muscles, but for the upper back muscles, it does not. And the reason it does not is because those muscles are slow twitch muscle fibers. Think about it like this. Their function is to hold you upright all day long. When you're sitting and you're trying to slouch, those upper back muscles are preventing you from slouching over. When you are standing and you're trying to slouch, those upper back muscles are preventing you from slouching over. They are at work 24/7. Your upper back muscles are working 24/7. So why would a measly maybe 3 sets of 10 do the trick for rear delts? They need a lot of volume. A lot of volume. I'm talking like high time under tension, high sets, high reps. Face pulls are great for training the upper back muscles for this purpose. Rear delt flies, it trains the rear delts, but it doesn't really get the muscles underneath of the rear delts. What I like to do, and this was taught to me by Joe DeFranco, so shout out to him, 100 band pull aparts. Doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a heavy band, just a really light band, and just do 100 of them. You can split them up however you want, but do 100 of them. Great for training those. Actually doing movements that cause external rotation, awesome for the upper back muscles. We focus so much on the exercises that internally rotate our shoulders and not enough external rotation. We do overhead pressing, we do bench pressing, we do the front raises. But when do we ever actually externally rotate our shoulders for something? We almost never. So, taking a very, very light weight on the cable machine, or even just a resistance tube, and just externally rotating it a bunch of times, awesome for the rotator cuff. Incorporating time under tension, look up YWTs, try to hold those for like 10 to 15 seconds at a time. Those are hard, by the way. To put it into perspective, I can overhead press 315. And I couldn't do a YWT for 10 seconds with a 2.5 pound weight in each hand. That's how hard it is. It is very difficult, and the reason why it's hard is because I never trained it. And the second I started training it, all of a sudden, my shoulders feel better during benching. I don't have that shoulder pain anymore. My shoulders feel better during overhead pressing. My shoulders feel better, period, throughout the day. But the beautiful thing about it is it's going to strengthen those upper back muscles, including the rotator cuff. And therefore, your Golgi tendon organ is not going to be tempted to shut off your pectoral muscles during a bench press. So, strengthen even the muscles that you cannot see, and your bench press will benefit. All right. Next up. And again, this is something that can apply to all lifts, and that is using leverage. I'm not talking about arching your back during a bench press. I'm talking about putting your body in a position that is advantageous for the lift. Let me give you one of my favorite examples for this. The lat pull down. What movement is the lat pull down doing? You're pulling a weight down. So Newton's third law, opposite reaction, opposite direction. So instead of pulling down, I'm going to be pulling down with my back muscles, my lats, but put your knees, drive your knees upwards into the pads on the lat pull down machine. That is going to provide your body leverage so you can lat pull down more. And it's not cheating. It's putting your body in a position that allows your muscles to be overloaded more. So bench pressing. You're pressing a movement. You're pressing an object horizontally away from you. So what's the opposite and equal reaction? Well, drive your upper back muscles into the bench. Squeeze and retract your shoulder blades. That is going to give you the leverage needed to complete the bench press better. And it's also going to spare your shoulders in the long run as well. And you can, literally any lift you can think of that involves an eccentric movement. So, no Olympic lifts. But anything else like a curl, a tricep, all of these, you can use leverage for. You just have to think about how to do it. All right, next up. And again, this works across the board for all lifts, but simply training your grip. If you can hold on to more weight, you can press more weight. If you can hold on to more weight, you can deadlift more weight. If you can hold on to more weight, you can do anything with more weight. So train your grip. As simple as that. Farmer's walks are great. I've been using a lot of fat grip training lately, I don't know if you look up fat grips. You basically artificially increase the diameter of whatever object you're holding on to, therefore stimulating your grip to work. Grippers. I'm a big fan of Captains of Crush. Go to their website. Also for training the crushing grip. Plate holds, ISO holds, anything that trains the grip. Try to do some form of grip training every day, and you'll get stronger across the board. All right, and the last two, I'm not really going to go into too much, just because I think most people already know about it. Number one, train your triceps. Your triceps are a heavy muscle involved in the bench press. So the stronger your triceps are, the more you're going to be able to bench. Again, you're only as strong as your weakest link. You could have strong pectoral muscles, but if your triceps suck, you're not going to be able to bench as much as you would like. By far, the best exercises that cross over to the bench, anything involving the long head of the tricep. Your tricep has three muscles, right? Tri means three. You have the medial head, the lateral head, and the long head. I think a lot of people love training the lateral head. They love doing the tricep pushdowns. But anything that stretches the tricep overhead, like seated dumbbell tricep extensions, skull crushers, those by far I have found have the best crossover to the bench. All right, shoulders, also pretty self-explanatory. I mean, your shoulders, specifically your anterior deltoids, are, huge in benching. So the stronger your shoulders are, the more you're going to be able to bench. In fact, I can actually give you a number here. And you could test this out on yourself to see where you fall in this range. But in general, your overhead press, the heavier your overhead press, the heavier your bench press, and vice versa. And there's actually a correlation. In general, your overhead press, your 1 rep max on the overhead press, will be usually somewhere between 60% and maybe 69% your 1 rep max of your bench press. Power lifters are usually on the lower end of that. They focus on the bench press very heavily, but not a lot of, overhead work because they're not bodybuilders. Whereas Olympic weightlifters are higher on that scale. They do a lot of overhead movements like snatches, clean and jerks, clean and presses, etc. But try to train the overhead press as often as you can, all the variations of it, to shock the muscle. The stronger your shoulders are at the overhead press, the more you're going to be able to bench press. All right. Last but not least, I'm going to give you a cheat. So, this is a way to bench heavier, not really involving training. Old school powerlifting technique. Think about this. Why? Okay. You can find a 180-pound powerlifter who can deadlift 700 pounds. You will have a hard time finding a 180-pound powerlifter who can bench press 500. Why? Because bench pressing, and in fact any form of upper body pushing, so your shoulder strength, your bench strength, your tricep strength, is very heavily dependent upon your body weight. Whereas the pulling movements, not so much. They still are, but just not as sensitive as the pushing movements are. And the thing about it is, it doesn't matter where that weight comes from. Whether be it muscular weight, fat weight, or, and here's the cheat, water weight. So, old school powerlifting technique. The day before you bench heavy, eat some ramen noodles. I know that's not the healthiest thing, but the high sodium content is going to make you retain more water, thereby increasing your weight, thereby increasing your bench press. And then as soon as you're done, you just pee out the excess water. If you're looking for a healthier way to go, take creatine before you bench. Drink a lot of water with it. Creatine makes your muscles absorb that water weight. And again, it contributes to a heavier bench. I love creatine on benching days. All right, so that's the cheat. Just as a follow-up, there are people who they love benching, but like NFL players, have to do a bench press test where they press 225 as many times as they can. And in my personal opinion, benching heavy is not the best way to train for that test. So I'm going to give you a method in which you can improve that 225 test. You look at where you fail when you start pressing for heavy reps. And usually it'll be around that 40 to 45 second range. That's when you're going to start experiencing that muscular failure. Because again, when it comes to high reps like that, your limiting factor is going to be how well does your body respond to time under tension. It's not how strong you are. That's your higher 1 rep max. When it comes to a 225-pound bench press for as many reps as you can, it's going to be how long can your muscles withstand that tension. So this goes, and I mentioned this in my last podcast, but doing timed sets will dramatically improve your 225 bench test. So what I mean by that is put a light weight on it, right? It doesn't matter how light. Put 100 pounds on it. It's still going to be hard. I want you to bench for a minute straight. Push out reps for a minute straight if you can. Every time you do it, try to go longer. What you're doing is you're training your muscles to be able to withstand that time under tension. Again, and the reason why this works is because doing something for as many reps as possible isn't a measurement of strength. It's more a measurement of endurance. But specifically, it's a measurement of how well your body responds to that time under tension. And the better it responds to it, the more you'll be able to go. All right, so follow all these tips, and you should be well on your way to a 2 times body weight bench press.